Welcome to the BEZA Performance Livestream. My name is Marshall Henley, the president of BEZA Performance. And at BEZA, we do leadership and executive disciplines like lean thinking, S&OP, cultural development, and net landed profit analytics. Today, we have S&OP Thursday, the second and fourth Thursday of every month, where we meet with Doug Dedman, the president and thought leader at DBM Systems. Welcome back, Doug. Let me get you up on screen here. Always do that to you.
Wow, it was a
Never
long
fails.
journey over there.
Yeah. Technology.
Yeah, there you
If
go.
I had five people helping me produce, we'd be better off. But so today's kind of a really important. I don't want to say it's a culmination, but we're kind of at a point where there's some important things we're going to talk about regarding how demand planning intersects S&OP and allows you to make important decisions, particularly decisions about constraining your demand based on your supply, which is very much the reason we have S&OP in the first place, but also kind of things are more constrained these days than they were maybe 2 years ago.
Yep.
So let's do our level setting that we like to do with folks just to kind of make sure they understand what we mean by S&OP. We view S&OP as the president's handle on the business, and it provides therefore a clear link between strategy and execution. And this is really important. It lets the president participate in setting the flow rate for the business by family. And so today you're going to see the gears come together and mesh around that very idea, along with the next one that you have clear, responsible, and accountable within the RACI accountabilities. And it's regular and repeatable monthly, and then you can measure progress. You should get better at your business and at S&OP as you do S&OP. And so kind of excited about this one, Doug.
Oh, good, good. Well, hopefully I can deliver for you. So
Yeah. No pressure. No
no
pressure.
pressure. Yeah, yeah,
Well, let's fire up your screen for everybody, and you can kind of walk us through what you're
yeah,
thinking.
yeah. So I just thought it would be good. I know we touched on the whole idea of constraining earlier on, and so I just thought maybe it'd be good to, as I think about S&OP and as we kind of work with people, like what should we be expecting kind of on this intersection between constraining demand and the S&OP process? And really we had pulled these points up earlier when we talked about this kind of at a higher level, but it's this idea that it should be clear in your S&OP process if you actually need to constrain the demand, right? So that's that
Right.
idea that you set the flow rate, and if that flow rate happens to be less than what my demand view is, I've got to be able to see that. It should be very, very obvious, right?
Yeah.
And so it should also be clear if we've done constraints in the past, right? So understanding when I look at my historical shipments and I look back, I should know, well, am I dealing in a constrained situation in the past? And what does that mean going forward? I think the one that we really want to drive today is thinking about how should you constrain demand, right? So like, how do you drive that decision? Where does that accountability lie?
Yeah.
Why does it belong as part of S&OP? And then really we should be able to see the impact of constraining demand, right? Because
Right.
once
And
it's great
who's getting impacted?
who's getting it, but then also what is the impact for those that we are actually constraining. So I
Yeah.
just to level set that piece. And then I think just one other one that I'd like to go through, or actually one other sort of slide to kind of bring this together.
Mhm.
And we've brought this up several times as we've gone through each one of these sessions, but it's important to think about, in simple terms, we say S&OP is is linking up demand and supply. Well, really, what we've got to be able to do in S&OP is we've got to be able to take a view that's above the line, right? That line is the customer external view of our business. That's an unconstrained view. It's the, hey, what could we provide, or what does our the marketplace want from us, and then how do we manage below the line at the constrained level? How do we manage that, and how do we manage the inflection point between that unconstrained and the constrained? And so when we think about S&OP, we've really got three elements. I just put them into two as we've kind of been going forward on this. One being,
Sure.
what is the S&OP process? How does it intersect with this unconstrained and the constrained? And then the S&OP structure, how we look at data. And this is pretty important for today. So I'm going to go through this kind of quickly, but then I'll make a couple points at the end. So
Okay.
everybody should be pretty familiar with the process, right? So we have this pre-S&OP demand meeting, which is entirely focused on what is that kind of the external view of of that demand. It's where we take all the input from all of our other demand planning exercises that we go through and how we put that in, and we look at that and we say, what does that unconstrained demand look like? And then beyond that, we then have operations come to us and say, okay, what can you get? And that is really in the S&OP operations meeting. And then what we're going to be talking about today is some of the decisions that have got to be made prior or within the pre-S&OP meeting to set
Yeah.
us up for how do we engage the executive in that executive S&OP, especially in a constrained environment.
So really, the constraints are going to lead us to some decisions that we're going to propose to the executive, and then the idea is the executive is going to authorize like one or more of the choices that we've had, but it's not going to be the decision on who and how the constraints are going to affect various people in demand streams. It's not going to be FIFO, and it's not going to be who screams the loudest, right? The
Right.
SOP process is there to get that done. Okay,
Right.
good.
Yep. Yep. Exactly. And so this is a big part of it. But then the other part that's pretty important as part of that is how do we actually view our families? And we've said this multiple times, but it bears repeating. If
Yes.
we start at the bottom here, our S&OP family needs to be at a constraint level internally. So we'll think about that. The easiest way to think about that would be potentially a production line, right? All the
Yeah.
product in that family coming down that particular production line. Because if I go back to the concept of what I have to see when I'm dealing with constraints, the number one thing is I need to see if I have to constrain demand. Well, I need to consolidate all of the demand above the line onto that particular production line. So above the line meaning that unconstrained demand, so I can see what is the total demand upon this family. And then I can know, oh, I've got to make a decision on how I'm going to do that constraint.
So
And
we could say it's like a line, a production line, but it could be more complex than that. But at the end of the day, you got to be able to buy it or make it to ship it. So whatever the family is, it shares that constraint. And I think production line is the easiest way to explain it, but not the
yeah,
only thing it
yeah,
might be.
it may be much more complex than
Yeah,
that, right? You might have shared
often.
resources, yeah, all that sort of stuff. And then what's really important, if you've been following these, and if you haven't been following us along, we spent a lot of time in the first few sessions on the 5-section sheet. What's important you're going to see today in order to do the constraining is two things. One is this concept of the demand streams, and the other one is what is the data that I require for those demand streams. So my bookings, my backlog, my shipment plan by demand stream. And then down here, you're going to see, in order to understand what I need to constrain, you're going to see the need for the capability and the production plan. So hopefully that resonates for those that have been watching a few of these. If not, I just encourage you to go back because I'll go through more detail on that. This is a kind of there's a lot in this topic. And so trying to
Yeah.
describe everything all in once, and you know me, Marshall, I could talk forever on this stuff, and we got,
Yeah.
half an hour. So
Yeah, but I will say, even if this is your first video, I think you're going to get a lot from it because Doug just showed is the essential way that we would say everyone should do S&OP. We've implemented this methodology in ETO, large industrial project companies that are producing, nuclear power plant equipment, and we've implemented it in folks who serve big box customers with, one day turnaround, make the
yeah,
stock, you name it. It works for all of them because it's essentially I always say it's the laws of physics for making and selling stuff,
yeah.
or buying and selling stuff. So, all
What
right,
is it you keep saying? If you can't build it, if you can't supply it, you can't sell it, right?
right.
So whether that's build or inventory. So
So that's
what
what
I
that's the model we just showed. Like that is the math behind that model. That's
yeah.
all we're talking about.
Yeah.
So,
So I thought what I would do is try and walk through like an example here. You might just have to remove your little the BEZA
yeah,
logo there at the top. Not that all the work I put into my graphics, I just want to make sure everybody gets the full impact of that.
Yeah,
Um,
sure.
so if I instead of doing it on a 5-section sheet, I thought I'd kind of go through an example to build this up a little bit. So one of the
Okay.
things when you think about the demand side and that unconstrained to constrained, that's really, really helpful, is to do some segmentation of your customers. So instead of thinking about, so at the top here, I've basically divided my customers into 4 kind of groups. I've got 2 large customers that are manufacturers. So where we're supplying product for them that's going into something else. So it's a B2B.
OEMs. Yeah.
Yeah, an OEM or something like that. And then I've got a distributor here that's about another 20% of my demand. And then I've got all my other small customers here. And the reason I divided that up, is um, when you're doing your demand planning, you're probably going to be doing it at a detail level, right? You might have 4 or 5 salespeople that are kind of managing this 20% of the customers, and they might be going through doing forecasting and all that sort of stuff. And I might have more than one distributor. But the reason I do this is because you want to sort of divide things up so that you've got the significant customer groupings. Because when we're thinking about S&OP, the decisions that we make are going to impact how we're able to provide for the demand to each one of those demand streams.
Right.
And so typically you're going to do a whole bunch of demand planning, detail level. And an example I'm going to give you here is, let's say that I've come up with a shipment forecast. This is for
Let me
this.
jump in. Let me jump
Yep.
in really quick just to make sure everybody's clear. Those are each demand streams like we've been talking about, and they are not based on dollars. Those are unit percentages. They're percentages of number of units from that family. So we
Yep.
have multiple demand streams into one family that we're talking about here, not dollars.
Yeah, that's a very good point. Thanks for catching that. So
Yeah,
when
no
I'm
problem.
talking, everything here is in units, and
Yeah.
so um, you know typically what's going to happen on the demand stream is you're going to have, and I took the large customer here. I, I've got a sales rep or someone that's working with them to kind of get, hey, what is the forecast you have going forward? You might be doing that in shipments. You might be doing that in bookings. The example I did here is I did it in shipments. And then at the demand stream level in S&OP, I like to take that demand plan, and I'm calling it a plan. It's the plan that my sales rep has worked with that OEM or with the distributor, or what the statistical forecast is here at the customer level. That plan, then I can also calculate or figure out what do I think my bookings plan is going to look like to feed that. And so the
Yeah.
example I have here is the orange line is my shipment line. I've set this up so I've got about 2 months worth of orders already in the books. And then I'm actually booking about 2 months in advance to hit the shipment plan that's out there. So you can see how my booking plan is going up in advance of my shipping plan by a couple months. And so by just using some real standard and simple math, if you generate a forecast at shipping forecast at from the sales side of things, you can then kind of back into, well, what do I think the bookings plan would look like to kind of feed that? And that's an important thing, because if I can measure both of those on a monthly basis, bookings are going to hit me before I get to shipments. And bookings become kind of that early indicator of, wow, what's going on? And you're going to see in a bit why that's important from a constraint
And
standpoint.
so people's models may be completely different than this. Obviously, this is an example, but so we're talking about the leftmost large customer, the 40% customer with
Yeah,
a 2 month delay after bookings to a shipment. And
right.
just to be clear, some people call booking sales. It could be POs, but it's essentially the transactional trigger that lets us know we're going to have to ship something in the future.
Yeah, I would say you want to be pretty clear on that. And I
Yeah.
look at bookings as being the orders that are going into your ERP system,
Yeah.
because when I book something, and I'm just going to bring up the next piece of that, when I book an order, it's going to end up, and I've called it my backlog. Some people
Yep.
call it my front log, and some people, it is my aged backlog. The orders that I take, the bookings that I take are going to be somewhere out in the future. And so, in the example I have in this case, where I have 2 months worth of backlog, I've got this month almost sold out. this month almost sold out for shipments. When I book that next order, the orders that I book in here, some of them are going to, or most of them are going to actually be orders that I plan to ship out in the third month.
Yeah.
And so that's an important part in the model, is to kind of get all those pictures together, because when I start making a constraining decision, that has an impact on my shipments, and it may have an impact on my bookings over time. But that is going to be an important part to be able to see what's the impact of that.
Yeah. So to be clear, this is one, you ought to have this picture of your demand streams measured in units, not dollars, for each of the 4 demand streams in this case that flow into one S&OP family that would have a shared constraint on meeting that demand.
Right. So you would end up with a picture. I know this is probably a little bit
good.
small for everybody to see. You nice segue, Marshall. Excellent work. But yeah, so if you look at it, I basically have drawn that, and you notice the one that's kind of interesting is this one here, which is, a typical case where you might be selling to a distributor where they're stocking your product and they're ordering on a couple months they're not ordering, some months they're ordering, all that sort of stuff. You have a lumpier demand because they're essentially carrying an inventory buffer, and they're doing some kind of forecast on that, right? And so you're going to get, these are just some examples here, right, of potentially how I do that. But an important thing about this is, and we use kind of a rule of thumb, don't get any more than like 8 demand streams, for a business, because you're doing all this demand planning and it's culminating into that pre-S&OP demand plan, where what you're going to be introducing there is, if let's say you're doing all your demand planning to do a shipment forecast, you want to be able to see, okay, based on some idea of what my lead time is and what my backlog is, what would I expect for bookings at the demand stream level? And also I want to overlay what is my current backlog, because I want to end up with a full picture for the family that's got, here is my planned shipments, that orange line. Here is the backlog that I have in month 1 and month 2 that's, makes up a portion of that. And so you can see I've almost got all of month 1's shipments sold out. I've got a little bit of book and ship. I've got a little bit more book and ship here. And I get out to month 3 and I'm just dealing straight forecast at this point in time.
Yeah.
And then I've done a projection of bookings on that. So the demand stream level, the idea of the pieces of data that I'm pulling together for that, it's pretty important as part of developing that demand plan. And you want to do all of that at that unconstrained view. Yeah. So it's because the problem is, if we start constraining right at the front, right, we start to end up with this self-fulfilling prophecy, right?
Yes.
Like it's, we're always not thinking about the demand that could be there. And it's an important thing to look at, because, we're in situations where we're at constraint and we want to add to it, but we're not quite sure how that's going to work. So you really want to look at this as an unconstrained standpoint.
So a couple of videos ago, we said, ignore this step at your peril. And this is exactly what we're talking about. If you don't start from an unconstrained view of the world, which was actually on the meeting flow, and that's Tom Wallace's meeting flow, right? You didn't invent that, but I'm not sure it's as obvious to folks that, especially not the clients I work with, that's why the meeting flow exists that way. That first meeting is to give you an unconstrained view of the universe so that you can take that forward and then make decisions based on who and what you're going to constrain.
Right.
From the unconstrained view.
And then what you want to do is you want to dive into the detail level on the constraint, right? So if we pull up the next slide there. So this is really that aggregate shipping plan that I had out there. That was my shipping forecast or shipping plan. And it's the total demand. It's summed up by that family, which we had defined at the constraint level, which means I should be able to assign a capability line to that. So I've put this one in here. It's a capability line. The first month is whatever I can produce plus whatever I have in inventory. That would be my capability for that month, right? And then going forward, you can see we've actually made a plan, because we knew the demand was going up. We made a plan that we're actually going to be, so in this
second
example,
shift or whatever it is.
Yeah, it's actually adding another a third shift.
Okay.
And so the plan is that, hey, we should be able to do that by month 4. And that really is my capability. Now, the challenge is when you're thinking about constraining is you don't want to just constrain to the capability number, because it's really hard for most operations to operate at full capacity all the time,
Yeah.
right? And so when we come up with a supply plan, that is really what can we produce, right? So the capability is what we could produce, but the supply plan is what we can produce. So that's where you factor in the risks. And so in the pre-S&OP supply meeting, you're going through that, developing that dotted green line to say, hey, what is that supply plan that we can do, right? And so, I'm looking at it from an aggregate standpoint to say that's what I need. And then if I remove the capability line and we've agreed that we can only produce this green line, the gap between the shipment plan and the production plan is basically where I've got a shortfall and I've actually got to do some
That
constraints.
that's the constraint. Yeah. That's whatever happens. Some people would say it's your backlog, but you may not make that decision, right? That's the whole idea, is to be able to
Right,
see both lines and make a decision on how
right.
you're going to handle it.
So the important part of this is being able to look at that. That's why I'm always insistent that you've got to bring that S&OP family down to that constraint level so you do
Yeah.
this, right?
Yeah. You
Um,
can't do it if you do it at the supply, at the
right.
demand or
Yeah.
customer
And
facing
so
level.
So if I sum that up, we have a shortfall of 120 units in month 1. And then if I take a cumulative look at that shortfall kind of going forward, we're about 620 units short by month 3. And so this is the important part and sometimes this happens, we get really myopic when we get in this constrained kind of situation, right? We're only always looking at, hey, what's in front of us. But by actually being able to lay this out, it starts to identify the decisions of where is something a short-term piece where I might be able to deal with it by running overtime, and where is it, where has it been a shift in demand or an anticipated shift in
Yeah.
demand that I want to react to, and I've got to actually put the plan in there. And it drives back to why I believe it's so important to measure that bookings piece, because before the demand happens, when I say that before the shipment happens, I have to get the order.
Yeah.
And in most people's businesses today, I'm dealing with some level of backlog or open orders. And so it means that the earliest indicator that that demand is going where I think it's going to be is that backlog. But now I got a decision, right?
Who
Who
gets the backlog and when?
who gets it, right?
Yeah.
So this now swings us back to this idea that prior to the pre-S&OP demand, at the pre-S&OP meeting, so after you went through demand and supply, we're now in the pre-S&OP meeting, or during the pre-S&OP meeting, I've got to start thinking about how I make that decision. And so if I look at it, I now have, if I bring these back in here, I have those 4 kind of customer groups that I had identified, and I have a question on how do I allocate, right? So if I look at it in month 1 alone, I have 990 units in backlog, and that means
Yeah.
990 units in aged backlog. If I added these up, should have maybe did this, but if I add the 480, the 180, the 150, and the 180, that equals the 990. It's saying that in month 1, I have 990 units on order that I promised to send out in that month. My shipment plan above that is actually goes up to 10,000 or to 1,050 units. So I really have another 60 units that I was hoping to get shipped out, but I got a problem because I could only get 900 in supply. And so the question is, who do I allocate that to? What's the decision I make? And this is where these demand streams are important, because
Yeah.
there, and by the way, there's no perfect answer. And there's no one size fits all answer for every business, right? Because think about it. I supply two large OEMs. They're a big part of my business. Typically, the units that I supply to them are going to be going into their production line. Do I want to short them, right, to make up for that shortfall? I've
Yeah.
got a distributor. Okay, I might have a bit of flexibility there because we talked about the lumpiness of the demand. Might be able to bring their inventory down a bit, but kind of bring by shipping a smaller quantity to them over the next few months. That's often a really good one that you can deal with because typically the OEMs are running a more just-in-time kind of situation, right? And then the question comes, what do you do with the all other customers, right? And so where do you do that? And the point of these demand streams and the point of driving to this is the fact that you want everybody to be on the same page as to where we're making that decision.
Yeah. It's
You
a
don't
joint
want to,
decision.
it's a joint decision. You don't
Doesn't
want
mean
to,
everybody's going to be happy with the decision, but at least everybody understands the rationale, because the reality is you're not getting more than I covered it up, but there's a
oh yeah,
constraint.
you're
You
not
have to
getting
deal
more
with the
than the
constraints.
900. Yep. Yep.
Right.
Yep. Well, and I can 100% guarantee you, you said not everybody is probably going to be happy. I guarantee you
Yeah.
there's going to be somebody who's not happy, right? Because,
Yeah. Constraints don't make people happy.
yeah, and it's interesting. Duncan McLeod, who he and I worked together for a long time. Duncan was the original principal of DBM, and he used to always tell stories of when he was in the T-bar business, supplying
Yeah.
T-bars for drop ceilings and stuff, and they just had a terrible service level, and what would happen is they were at somewhere around the 50% service level. So that meant like if you got an order in there, you had a 50% chance that you're going to get it, when they promised it, right? But the president, if somebody called the president, he could move heaven and earth to get that product out the door. But the reality was that it wasn't a case of all of a sudden we found, another 50% worth of production that we could do. It was a case that they stole from somebody else to kind of get that 50% out the door. And the president goes,
Yeah.
why can I solve this problem every time it comes up?
Because you're
Well,
ignoring the results of the problem that you just solved.
right. And that's a big part of this to kind of
Yeah.
to make it, it's not the nitty gritty detail down to, okay, specifically which orders, but it's providing the guidance and the framework that says, okay, so where are we going to try and do those allocations?
Yeah.
And the recognition that, yeah, we've got to do it. And so that when somebody comes out of this and says, well, I didn't realize we were in a constrained situation, that that's really unacceptable.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Everybody needs to be aware of that side of things, and constraining is definitely going to have an impact. We kind of, it's so there is the decision of who do you constrain, right?
Yeah.
And there's a bunch of strategic impact to how you do that, but then there's also an impact around the constraining, and it kind of ties back to why I think it's so important that you look at bookings and shipments and backlog. And if you just flip to the screen for a second, I'll just show this for a minute. But if I for a minute, if I said I'm going to take that number one customer and I'm going to do some constraining. If you look at it, I've got my backlog if it was unconstrained, which would be right now. I have in this month, I'm starting with 480 plus 500, so that's 980 units. I'm going to ship out 500 and I'm going to book 520, which means my total backlog at the end of the month is going to be 1,000 units. The next month, I actually plan to ship 520 and book 480. Meaning I'm going to ship. I'm going to ship 500, or sorry, I'm going to ship 40 units less. I'm going to take my backlog down to 960. And you can kind of see that math going forward. If I decide I'm going to constrain, so let's say that I decide I'm going to constrain, and in this first month, I basically say, I'm only going to ship what you already had on order, that 480. I'm only going to ship what you already had on order in month 2. And then I'm going to short ship you for the next couple months until, kind of out here in the future. Well, what is the impact of that? Well,
Yeah.
the first thing you want to assume is, if I continue to get the orders from this particular customer, I'm going to start to grow my backlog. And so I can see that so our first thing on constraining is sales has developed a shipping plan, and they've developed a booking plan based on that. The initial thought of that is, if I constrain the shipments, I should really keep the bookings where they are. Now, eventually over time, and this is a decision you've got to make, is eventually over time, if you stop shipping what your customer wants, they might stop booking all the things you thought they were going to book,
Yeah.
right?
Or if you tell them it's going to be 6 months, then they might stop booking.
Right. But what's important on this, and why you want to see that, is because if I see this backlog growing, and if I see that in aggregate over all of my families, well, what does that mean? Well, you can think about backlog as really equating to lead time, right? The more orders you have in backlog, the longer it's going to take for you to clear that, meaning it's going to impact your lead time. So it's an important thing to think through as you're going through that process. So that's one of the impacts. So,
so I think this really helps illustrate. I mean, we're not telling you who to constrain, and I mean, there's no algorithm for that. That's your
no,
business.
no,
But what a properly implemented S&OP does with multiple demand streams, so with a many to many, relationship between demand streams and constraint-based families, is it allows you it forces you actually to answer the most important questions in your business. I often think of it as, we want to get everybody on the bus and they all help us decide where to drive the bus. But there's an assumption there that somebody turns the wheel and the bus goes left, not right. And this is that. I think there's a set of gears that connect the thinking on what we ought to do to what we actually do. And this is, at the right level, the aggregate that allows the executive to participate in that. And that's why it links strategy to execution, because strategy is going to find its way into those constraint decisions, right? I
yeah,
remember we were working with one client, and I think most people don't want to not serve a client as their answer, but the math was coming out that they were significantly increasing their backlog over time, and it was going to be difficult to increase capacity. And they had a sales rep working on a new client called Walmart that they were going to have to start shipping to at some point if they actually closed the deal. And
yep,
the reality was the president had to decide, okay, am I going to move heaven and earth and ask for more capital from corporate, because it was owned by a bigger conglomerate, to build the capacity I'm going to need if we get Walmart? Or am I going to tell Walmart, we're just not ready for you, at least not this year? And I think the
right,
latter happened. And in
yep,
that case, we're looking at somebody saying, no, we're not going to increase the backlog, because it wouldn't, we'd never even get to that backlog. We're going to go ahead and just say no to
right,
somebody. And
right. And that,
not a
and that,
common decision, but
no, but it's definitely one that I think we're
right.
seeing a lot more right now, right? Because it's, there seems like there's other opportunity beyond what we currently have, and we want to
Yeah.
think about, well, how do we capture that? So I think the points you made, I just had one other slide, Marshall, to kind of bring that up, and it was just maybe the points, and I think these would just, it's kind of the salient points to this. How you constrain. In other words, who that you're allocating, a limit supply to, is a strategic decision, right?
Yeah.
And your point of having people on the bus, kind of that idea is everybody should be on the same page. There's not there, it'd be terrible. Somebody's steering the bus, the guy jumps up from the back seat, comes running forward and cranks the wheel. That's kind of a recipe for disaster, right?
Yeah.
And too often that's a bit what happens, right?
Yeah.
You want to get everyone on the same page of this. And then, you hopefully saw a little bit of this from the time frame, like constraining an allocation is an in tight. It's stuff that you typically
Yeah.
have to do kind of, in the very imminent part of your planning process.
Depends on your
The
supply chain, your lead
Right,
times, but
right. That
everybody's got to do it.
exactly. Yeah. So where is that? But then the challenge is, if you don't address those constraints, right? If you're not thinking about this strategically and thinking about, okay, well, what is that overall demand? And that's where that bookings piece comes in. You'll never get out of that in tight situation. And there's probably people that are listening to this and go, yeah, man, that's my life. Right. Like
Yeah.
we're just, every day I come in and all I'm doing is just dealing with who do I take this from to give to this other person, right?
Yeah.
And then and then I think the other one that's really important, and there's really three things on the accountability side. And this goes back to the 5 section sheet piece where we say you've got to have bookings, you've got to have shipments, you've got to have backlog, you've got to have production, and you've got to have inventory. Because on the accountability side, operations owns what you can get on the production side. So when we had that capability not line that we had there, and then we put, okay, well, what does the supply look like? Operations owns saying, what can I get there?
Yeah.
And they 100% own getting that number at the end of every month, right?
Yeah.
Like that's they've got to own that piece.
And ultimately, there's an executive, typically a vice president of operations or somebody like that, that owns that for all the families in the
Right.
company. So
Right.
there's a sign off at that level.
Yep. And then you really want sales to own who gets what it is, right? So that's part of sales, and but it's got to be an important one that the executive owns the approval of that combined decision because
Yeah.
and it's got to be, I'll call it, the going to your point of the vice president of operations, the vice president of sales. If there's some trade-offs that need to be made, they really have to be able to own that, and it should be real clear to the executive, these are the decisions that we're making. Because at the end of the day, when you've got the problem with multiple customers,
Yeah.
and we're seeing this with some of our clients now. What's the president spending a bunch of his time? He's on the road show. He's going out to these customers, assuring them that this is where we're going to be at. Think about having a process that's kind of laid that out, at least laid that framework out that said, these are the decisions we're going to make. Like you said,
Yeah.
not everybody's going to be happy,
Right.
but it would give me, as the executive, it gives me a little bit more confidence and ammunition when I'm in front of that customer. Hopefully, it's not the one you're doing all the allocations away from, but but part of
There's
that,
always somebody.
well, you know what, there, in the reality that not everything can be good news.
Yeah. Well, and
Most customers.
the further
Oh, go ahead.
reality is it's a decision that the executive's participating in. I mean, we say the president, but it's really the person who owns both the demand and the supply side. There's report ups to that person, so that even if it's by proxy, right? We have some big multi-billion-dollar companies where you don't really see demand and supply coming together until you get to a level where it's so high, maybe it would be difficult to manage. But the there's often presidents of business units that then own that, but they
Yep.
don't maybe own all of their supply. But by proxy, they can still exert their influence, and they have to sign off on this idea of how are we going to make those constraining decisions, and or in the future, we showed it. How are we going to invest the capital, or spend money on a third shift? I mean,
Yep.
all those decisions typically can't be made exclusively by a VP of operations or a VP of sales. So, in a traditional company with a hierarchy, then that's going to be someone like a president. But
Yep.
um, so
Yeah, and if you look at this and you're going, well, wait a second, how like this looks like a lot of detail for an S&OP process. There's a couple tricks to being able to do this. Number one is that family structure, right? So it's got to start. You've got to bring it down to that constraint level, and then you simplify your demand picture. Don't look at all of the stuff that you're dealing, but simplify your demand picture into
yeah,
kind of those major customers or major types of customers, so that that's typically where you're going to have to be making those decisions. The other huge part of this, and this is where the 5 section sheet comes up so
yeah,
importantly, right, is it provides you a framework that pulls all of that together and really kind of forces you. What was the term you used? It kind of it's the model of the business. It really forces you to say, hey, does all the math work, right? The
yeah,
physics of the process, if you
yeah.
will, right?
You can't. You can't be in denial with a good S&OP process. Well,
Right.
guess you could be. It's going to be psychological denial, not mathematical denial.
Yeah, and so that's the important part. So hopefully people found this. It's been a big part of what we've been kind of working through in the last while, because everybody that we're working with is in this situation. It's an
Yeah.
important and part of it. And and seeing the executives that are able to you know, actually see what's happening, from that disconnect, and having to force that reality. As much as it's painful, it's it's a lot less pain than, the death by 1,000 paper cuts that you go through as you try to, oh, I got to deal with this customer, I got to deal with this customer, I got to track all of this sort of stuff.
Oh
So
yeah.
I know we went a little bit over time.
It's okay.
Yep.
We didn't tell anybody it's going to be an exact time, I don't think, but
Okay.
we are going to wrap up here, folks. I want to appreciate Doug again for joining us on S&OP Thursday in July. S&OP Thursday will be I believe the 14th and the 28th, and we'll continue with our thinking on, what's currently kind of hot, like constraining your demand with your supply. That's maybe being constrained outside of your control. So we'll kind of announce the topics in advance and get it posted on LinkedIn and YouTube. And until then, see you later. Have a good month.